welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. We are so glad to see you, and this event tonight with Caroline Fraser is sponsored by the Public Library and Prairie Lights Together. So we're going to be meeting Caroline Fraser, and she has edited this beautiful 2-volume set that includes all the Laura Ingalls Wilder books and some special things in the back that she's going to tell you about. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Caroline. She's on a book tour. She was scheduled to come here a little bit ago and got stuck in New York with Sandy. And she was there a long time, so she didn't get to Iowa City then, and that's why we're rescheduled tonight. But here she is, and we're all very excited if we heard the interview on public radio this morning that we get to also ask questions and hear about her process and hear about Laura. Caroline was born in Seattle. She's lived on both coasts, currently is living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and her work has included, she's a poet, she's won awards, done lots of reviews, written for New Yorker and the New York Book Review and Atlantic, and she's just really had an illustrious career. Her PhD is from Harvard in English and American Lit. So she's the perfect person to delve into Laura Ingalls Wilder's life and writings, and I think she'll tell us lots of interesting things tonight. I look very much forward. So please welcome her to our event.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Barb for being part of all this, and to Maeve Clark for helping set this whole thing up, and for being so patient since I was supposed to come in October. And to all the people at Prairie Lights, which is just, I was able to go there today, and it's what a fantastic bookstore. You guys are so lucky to have that. So I'm just quickly going to show you 10 or so slides of Laura Ingalls Wilder at different points in her life that I think help illustrate some of the things that are special about the Library of America edition. And she lived from 1867 to 1957, so that's about 90 years. Her life spanned a whole period of American history. And the books, the Library of America books, add a little bit to what you may have seen before. The Garth Williams illustrated edition that we probably all read as kids came out in 1953, and this is the first time that we've been able to sort of make some corrections to the text, correct typographical errors, and also just add a few things but in the way of notes and so forth. And a chronology of her life, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I just wanted to show you a few slides of Laura. This is a very famous photograph of the 3 Ingalls sisters. This is Carrie Ingalls on the left, Mary, who is seated, and Laura, who's standing. There's, of course, another child, Grace, who's not depicted in this photograph. And we actually don't know a lot about this photograph. We don't know exactly when it was taken, sometime in the late 1870s or early 1880s. And we don't even know whether Mary, as many of you who have read the books probably know, Mary did go blind. In 1879, and we don't know if she's blind in this photograph or not. Some people think maybe she is, some people think she's not. But one thing that we do know is how much these girls had experienced by the time this photograph was taken. They had been through an incredible series of ordeals. They had traveled over 1,000 miles from Wisconsin to Kansas and back again. They had lived through prairie wildfires. They had lived through they had crossed flooding rivers and lived through blizzards and one of the most fantastically destructive natural disasters that the country had ever seen, which was the locust plague of 1874 to 1875, which is not all that well known today, but was a huge thing at the time. It was a vast cloud of locusts that covered 198,000 square miles and consisted of 3.5 trillion insects, if you can imagine. And which of course destroyed about half the country's agriculture in 1875. They think that some people actually did starve to death in some of the affected states, although they did distribute some government aid. And these little girls lived through all of this stuff, and without anything that we take for granted now. They didn't have any kind of government services, really. They didn't have electricity, no running water, no firemen, no policemen, no FEMA, which I was thinking about during Hurricane Sandy. Nothing like the Red Cross or anything of that nature. And so they really had been through a lot, which I think you can kind of see in this photograph. They look a little older than their years, maybe. But they lived through it, I think, with an extraordinary, if you've read the books, you can see with what good grace and good nature and fortitude they faced all of these things. And I think that can be attributed in large part to the closeness of their family bond. They were very close to their parents, close to each other. And it's really amazing to read these books and sort of think about, as an adult, think about what these kids had been through. And think about how they dealt with it. This is Laura at 17. By this time she's taught school, she's been teaching school. She worked a lot. She and her sister Mary, before Mary did have the illness that caused her to go blind, they worked in service. I mean, not in the same way as in Downton Abbey or something like that, but they worked in a hotel, they waited on tables, they cleaned, they swept, they cared for other people's kids, and then she taught at 17 to help send her sister to a college for the blind. She was being courted around this time by this fellow, Almanzo Wilder. They had a sort of very touching romance after he saved the town of De Smet, South Dakota, from near starvation by traveling across the prairie in what they called the hard winter of 1880 to 81, when there were blizzards like nearly every day for months at a time, and the trains couldn't get through. And he and another fellow rode out at great risk to their lives to get wheat to feed the town. They became engaged, they got married in 1885. She was always a little bit embarrassed about the difference in their ages. He was about 10 years older than she was, and they married fairly young, and she kind of minimized that in the books. She made the difference in their ages less because she was sort of embarrassed about that, although I think it was quite common actually at the time. This is the winter that they got married in 1885, and they had a really terrible time after they got married. Things started out well. They had a baby girl named Rose the year after they got married. But their crops failed year after year. They had, extreme weather events. There was hail and high winds that wiped out their crops. And Almanzo had built a beautiful house for Laura on his tree claim outside of the town of De Smet, South Dakota. But he'd gone into some significant debt to build her the house. And so when the crops failed, there was really no way they could kind of get out of debt. And they really had a tough time. She had another child, a baby boy, who died a couple of weeks after he was born. The couple became ill with diphtheria, and the diphtheria, Laura recovered from it pretty readily, but Almanzo went back to work a little too soon against doctor's orders and suffered a stroke that affected him for the rest of his life. He had a disability. He had a weakness on one side and couldn't really, I think I must have touched
No, I don't think so.
something.
We'll fix it. You just keep talking.
Okay. So the two of them just had a really tough time the first initial years after they got married, and then shortly after their baby boy died, their house burned down, and that was really kind of the last straw. That was economic ruin for them, because there was no way that they could dig themselves out of the hole of not having a house, of not having any way to really, Almanzo couldn't work very well after his stroke, and so he couldn't do the hard labor that was required in dry land farming at that time. I mean, it was just a kind of back-breaking labor. That locust event was the largest locust swarm in recorded human history.
And what
And it
states
has
did it
never
cover?
happened again. Well, it covered the entire Great Plains region, really, from Canada all the way down to Texas. Not all of those states, but parts of of most of those states, and sometimes, Kansas, I think, and Nebraska were really hard hit, in Minnesota. And the really strange thing about the locust story, and somebody has written a book about this, which you may even have here in the library, is that shortly after this massive outbreak, which was triggered by drought, by severe drought, because the drought favors locusts. It sort of provides them with more nourishment, because it intensifies the sugars in plants, and so it provides kind of the perfect, that locusts don't usually swarm every year. They only swarm when conditions are right. But by 1901, 1902, the species, the Rocky Mountain locust species, had gone extinct.
Oh.
And they still don't know why that happened. There's a theory that the spread of agriculture across the Great Plains altered the ecosystem of that, altered the plant communities in that habitat so powerfully, along with the loss of buffalo and the loss of beaver and, some other important species, that the locust essentially went extinct. And biologists are actually really interested in how, what exactly happened, because there is a fear, I think, that, the extinction of that species acted actually as a huge benefit to American agriculture, because North America became the only continent that didn't have a swarming locust. It was the only inhabited continent on Earth.
Wow.
So it really favored the United States becoming a country that was very powerful agriculturally and could export to other countries eventually. And there is a suspicion that that insect is perhaps not extinct. Although it hasn't been seen in a long time, they can't identify the individuals that they have left in some of the museums. They're not in very good condition for their DNA, so they're not 100% sure that it's extinct. And they've gone to glaciers, with the glaciers melting because of climate change, the ice is melting and exposing the corpses of some of these insects. So it's a really interesting story for ecologists. And the next photo I'm going to show you is from 1894, which is it's a family group of the Ingalls family, And it's a very important moment, I think, in Laura's life, because this is the point at which she has to leave. She and her family, Almanzo and Rose, have to leave South Dakota. They've been kind of drifting after the loss of their house, after the loss of their baby. They travel a little bit, they go visit his parents, they go to Florida for a short time, but then they come back to DeSmet and they work, they save money, and they hear about a place in Missouri where property is fairly inexpensive and can be afforded by people who have saved up $100, which is the amount of money that they had. And so they go to this place by covered wagon called Mansfield, Missouri. They purchase a piece of property. It's not particularly good farming property. It's got a lot of rocks on it. She calls it Rocky Ridge Farm. And life there is pretty tough for them too. You know, they spend the whole first year cutting timber on the land, the two of them, to sell in order to buy food. And eventually they move into Mansfield, into the town, so it's easier for Rose to go to school. They're working. Laura works serving meals to people who come through on the train. Almanzo's working as a delivery man. He meets people at the train with a horse and a delivery vehicle, and takes them where they need to go and delivers freight and stuff. And this is how they go. You know, they kind of survive like this for as Rose grows up. She then becomes, after she graduates from high school, she goes to the big city of Kansas City and becomes a telegraph operator. And then she makes her way over to San Francisco and starts working for newspapers, which are, that's kind of a big deal then, that she was able to kind of make that jump and become a journalist. She becomes a very successful writer and journalist, and Laura starts to kind of follow in her footsteps. Rose is just a very funny character, very forceful person, is constantly dreaming up ways for her mother to make more money. And one of the ways that she suggests is for Laura to start writing too. And the two of them discuss Laura writing a memoir, fairly early on, even like in 1915. And Laura does start writing for a newspaper. She's by this time become a fairly successful farmer. She's very good with hens, very good with egg production. She writes about this for a newspaper called the Missouri Ruralist, and eventually becomes their farm columnist, writing a couple times a month. And as that's a fairly serious gig to write a column a couple of times a month. And so she has to keep coming up with material, and she starts kind of delving into her past and thinking, about some of her extraordinary adventures. She writes columns about the hard winter that they survived. She writes about the prairies and how much she misses the wildflowers of the Great Plains. And, there we go. And so she's gradually kind of getting her feet wet with this material. There we go.
Round of applause.
Nice job. Way to go.
Yeah, that's exactly perfect. So this is the family group I was talking about in 1894. This is the Ingalls family. That's Ma, as you may know her, Caroline Ingalls, seated on the left, and then in the middle, Charles Ingalls and Mary, seated on the right, and then Carrie behind her mother, Laura behind Pa, and Grace, the youngest daughter. And one of the things I was going to say about this photograph that I think is really kind of poignant is that this is the moment right before Laura has to leave home. And she's standing behind her father with her hand on his shoulder. And this, in fact, is the last time that she will see him until he's on his deathbed in 1902. And so this really, I think, represents her break with the family, which I think was very reluctant on her part. I don't think, she really welcomed that, and I don't think she ever really got over it. I think that the books, the novels she would later write, were inspired in large part by the fact that she had to leave the people that she was closest to in the world. And while they did establish a fairly successful life eventually in Missouri, I think she never really got over this loss to her. And this is when she's around 50. This is about 1917. This is the time when she's writing for the newspaper and really getting herself established as a writer. And not that long after this picture was taken, her mother, Caroline Ingalls, dies in 1924. And she wrote in The Ruralist, I'm just going to read you a sentence of this because I think it's so striking. She wrote, "Memories. Sometimes I wonder if they are our treasures in heaven or the consuming fires of torment when we carry them with us." And I think that tells you a lot about how hard it was for her to lose these people, how difficult it was for her to reach back in time and remember all of these things about relationships that were now lost. And then a few years after her mother dies, Mary dies, the last time she saw them was in 1902 when her father died. Because of course in this time, people couldn't get on a plane and go visit. It was very, very difficult and expensive. And these are people who really didn't have very much money. And now we're going to skip ahead to the fall of 1937. And in that period of time, between when she was 50 to when she was 70, she really buckled down, and I think it was the death of her mother and her sister Mary that made her feel like, if I'm going to write about these people, and memorialize them in the way that I want to, I'm going to have to do it now because time is running out. In 1930, she sits down with a tablet from the dime store and writes her memoir, which is never published. It's during her lifetime, it's actually about to be published, I think by the University of South Dakota Press. But during her lifetime, she writes this memoir. Rose tries to sell it to a number of magazines, like the Saturday Evening Post, and it's rejected by a number of magazines. But Rose takes a little sort of spark from it, writes a short 20-page treatment for children, sends it around to book publishers, and Knopf immediately picked up on how interesting this was as a children's book and wrote to Laura and said, would you be willing to sit down and write 20,000 words for a children's book for 8 to 10-year-olds? And that's what she does. And that's how she got started writing these books, was, very late in her life. Really, she's in her 60s when she starts to do this. This photograph is taken in 1937, just on the publication of the 4th book, On the Banks of Plum Creek, which is the one with all the locusts in it. and at this time, she goes out to publicize the books, really for the first time. And they send her to Detroit to a department store that's having a book festival. And for this event, she writes a speech, which really becomes, and it's in the first of these volumes, in the appendix. It becomes really, I think, her most important statement of what she thinks the books can accomplish. And it really sets out, for the first time, her idea of what they're about. And I just want to read you a couple of paragraphs from this, because I think it's so interesting. She writes, "We had a busy, happy childhood, but of it all, Sister Mary and I loved Pa's stories best. We never forgot them, and I have always felt they were too good to be altogether lost." These, of course, are the stories in Little House in the Big Woods, her first book. "Children today could not have a childhood like mine in the big woods of Wisconsin, but they could learn of it and hear the stories that Pa used to tell. I began to think what a wonderful childhood I had had, how I had seen the whole frontier, the woods, the Indian country of the Great Plains, the frontier towns, the building of railroads in wild, unsettled country, homesteading and farmers coming in to take possession. I realized that I had seen and lived it all the successive phases of the frontier. First the frontiersman, then the pioneer, then the farmers and the towns. Then I understood that in my own life, I represented a whole period of American history, that the frontier was gone and agricultural settlements had taken its place when I married a farmer. It seemed to me that my childhood had been much richer and more interesting than that of children today, even with all the modern inventions and improvements. I wanted the children now to understand more about the beginnings of things, to know what is behind the things they see, what it is that made America as they know it. So that, I think, is her most important statement of her goals. This is another picture of her around the same time. And finally, Almanzo lived a fairly long life. He died in 1949. And this is Laura in her last public appearance at Brown's Bookstore in Springfield, Missouri in 1952. She's 85 here.
Wow.
She became increasingly frail in her later years, so she didn't do a lot of traveling. One of the interesting things about this photo is you can see the books lined up on the shelves behind her are all of the first edition of the books, which are not, most of us are not familiar with those because they were replaced the following year in 1953 by the edition that we all know that was illustrated by Garth Williams. This was a huge event. She became very celebrated, very successful. When she died, she had something like $77,000 in her estate. So she had a much easier life at the end than she did at the beginning. And I just want to close by telling you a couple of things about this edition, which are new. I told you about the corrections to the text, but what this also provides is there's a fairly extensive chronology of Wilder's life in the back that goes over her life year by year. So if you're interested in how her life differed from the novels, because they are novels, they're autobiographical, but she did fictionalize a lot of material, then that's one way to sort of compare what happens in the books with what actually happened to her in real life. We also have notes in the back that explain some of the publishing history of the books, which is fairly complicated. I haven't gone into that tonight, but Rose did help her mother quite a bit in writing these books, helped her learn how to do certain fictional techniques, how to write dialogue, how to structure a novel. And there's a lot of material about that. And there's also, I think, the notes that put the books in the historical context that they belong in, that explain a lot of the things that are mentioned in the book, or that are actually quite important in the book, like the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Minnesota Massacre, which is mentioned several times in Little House on the Prairie. These things are explained in a way that if you're interested in this kind of stuff, or the locust plague, you can actually find out more about it. There's a bibliography of sorts at the beginning of the notes. So that's what these books are. I think that they offer a lot of opportunities for teachers, and as well as just for reading the books for pleasure if you're an adult or a young adult and prefer to read the unillustrated version, because obviously kids are still going to want to read the Garth Williams books because they're designed for kids and are wonderful. But these are more aimed at people who want to consider these books as literature and as part of American history. So I think now Barb and I are just going to have a back and forth, a little conversation, and happy to take your questions as well.
Yeah, let's have lights on. Nice to have a comfy chair down at the library to be able to sit down. If you want to move up closer, please feel free to do that. Well, Caroline, one thing I noticed while we were looking at the photographs was all the different sources, and I just wanted to know, in your research, were you traveling around the country going to all these places, or how do you figure out who has what and what's important for you?
Yeah, I actually came here. I came to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library just down the road, about 10 miles, which is one of the most important repositories because of her materials, because Rose wrote a biography of Herbert Hoover, which I think she later had a kind of falling out with the president, but she didn't approve of his politics later on. But a large amount of her letters and photographs are deposited at
Here
the
at the
Herbert.
Hoover?
Yeah, which is a wonderful place to work. I've been to DeSmet before. When I worked on this in the 90s, I did go to DeSmet in South Dakota. But I didn't go to Mansfield. At Mansfield, there's her house, which is a kind of museum.
Is it?
Now it's but they don't have a librarian or a curator there, unfortunately, so that's not really open for.
So for people wanting to follow her footsteps or follow things in the book, are there certain places besides the research at the Hoover that you would say are
Yeah.
really rich sites to visit?
Yes, I think people would love to go to Mansfield. There are a number of objects there. Her father's violin is there, and you can see her house.
Yeah.
As she and Almanzo built it and remodeled it and renovated it, and so I think Mansfield is a wonderful place to visit. There's also a site in Kansas near Independence. Where the little house on the prairie was. I mean, it's a reconstruction. It's not the original cabin, but I think it's probably fascinating. I've always wanted to go there and see that. And DeSmet is fascinating as well. There's the surveyor's house, which you may remember from by the shores of Silver Lake, which has been moved into town. And various, there's the last house that Charles Ingalls built that's in the town of DeSmet. So it's well worth a visit. There's Minnesota as well, Walnut Grove, and Pepin, Wisconsin, where she was born, where I've always wanted to go because my grandmother was from a town nearby. So, but I haven't been to all these places.
So in your role as editor of really looking at the books again, you mentioned that you were working on correcting typos, and what else? What else happened with? You didn't change the words, right?
No, and in fact, everything that we did change is listed in the back. So if you're wondering what the heck we did, all you have to do is look at the list in the back. We did correct her spelling of Brookings, which is a town in South Dakota, which she misspelled, and I think she did intend to fix that in a later printing, but didn't get around to it. But really, it's fairly, minor stuff in terms of the corrections.
And how long have you been working on it?
For about a year and a half, I think, all told. But I had worked on some material about Wilder in the 90s, in which I examined some of
When
the-
you mentioned that you read something in 93, was it? I don't know that the whole audience knows about that, you heard something or read something about a new book coming out?
Well, in the mid-90s, a fellow who was a professor at the University of Missouri named William Holtz published a biography of Rose Wilder Lane, Wilder's daughter, which is kind of a fascinating biography of Rose. But the crazy thing about it, from my point of view, was that he argued that Rose was really the ghostwriter of the Little House books, that Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't really write them, that her daughter really was responsible for writing them. And I was skeptical about that. I heard about it in a piece in NPR. It became quite a scandal, really. There were a lot of sensational headlines about it, like little fraud on the prairie. There was a lot of stuff like that, which I thought was, and in graduate school, one of the things that was always hammered into me was to look at the footnotes of things and see if they were,
Authenticity, yeah.
see if they were accurate. And I looked at some of her manuscripts that were available on microfilm. And I just don't think that his argument stands up very well because, we have a very well-defined idea of authorship in literature, in literary studies, and the author is the person who sits down with a blank piece of paper and writes something original and creates something original. And that's what Laura Ingalls Wilder did, was she sat down with these dime store tablets, which you can still see. I've seen them. Her last novel is at the Hoover. And those exist. And we don't know what all the stages were, because I think a lot of her materials are missing. They probably were disposed of or, burned up in the fire or whatever. We don't have every single stage of every manuscript, but we certainly have enough of her writing to establish that she was the principal author of these books. And I think also it's hard sometimes for people who haven't worked in trade publishing to know how much editors contribute to published works. And there are many instances of this, famous instances of, T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. I mean, they've published all his manuscripts, and Ezra Pound rewrote that poem practically, from. So there are a lot of instances where editors heavily contributed to a work.
So Rose did, you said,
And
help,
Rose certainly did
taught her
that.
how to write dialogue
Yeah.
and tips like that, which an editor would
Yeah.
do
So
for
I
many
think,
people.
I think Rose is really the editor of the books.
Okay.
She probably went further than some editors would go.
But you said Laura kept her own things sometimes. She
Yeah.
just ignored what
Yeah,
what
there
Rose said.
are letters and lists that Laura would write out of saying, don't do that, I don't like that, and she would cross things out.
Yeah.
And so it was very much a collaboration.
Collaboration, okay. Well, I think that I wanted to ask you, in this time period, so you've been immersed kind of in her life since around the early 90s, and we obviously have people who love the books, and in the bookstore we have kids, parents, grandparents, people coming in every week still looking for the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. They have maintained that popularity. So why do you think, what are you hearing from people, and why do you think people respond so readily to the work still?
Well, they're beautifully written to start with. I mean, I think she had a great ear. She also really did capture people. You know, her portraits of people are just, you know, particularly her father, I think. You know, she intended the books as a kind of memorial to him, to try to, you know, show people what an incredible man he was, and preserve his love of music. You know, this is another way in which the books are fantastic. You know, they're a compendium of American vernacular music. There's like over 120 songs in these books. You know, all kinds of songs, Christmas songs, patriotic songs, things that we know today really well, like Oh Susanna or Yankee Doodle or whatever, but there's also a lot of hymns and religious songs that are not known anymore, but that are woven together with the text in a way that's really unique and beautifully done.
That's really
You know,
interesting.
like in Little House on the Prairie, there's the song The Blue Juniata about the Indian maiden. That's her Indian novel about, you know, which is very controversial now, and rightly so, but is a very fascinating, I think, way of talking about the issues of, you know, manifest destiny and why settlers felt that it was, you know, their right to go across the West and take the lands of people that didn't belong to them. It's a fascinating sort of history behind all that.
Well, how about in the audience? Are there questions that you have for Caroline tonight?
I have questions. Sorry.
We have a microphone over here. You can step right up, and because we're being taped, they want to be able to hear your questions.
Well, actually, we're live, like movie stars. Live.
Oh,
So I have a couple questions about the book. So the books, are they in public domain?
No, they did, the Library of America is a nonprofit foundation, and they did work out a deal with the estate. I think that they're under copyright until 2025 or something like that.
So my next question has to do with the Library of America. Usually the Library of America, if you have a collection of their books, they all look the same. They're those black books with the red and white
Yeah,
stripes on them. And this is smaller, correct? And it's beautiful. I mean, it's just absolutely, the case is gorgeous, and then the two illustrations on the small books are,
Yeah.
how did that happen?
It's actually available in two formats. It's available in the traditional cover. All of the Library of America books have this black cover with the stripe on them. But it's also available in that box set. These are sold individually, and the box set is only available.
So have they ever done this before?
Yeah.
They
Yeah,
have?
those are available by subscription, but they also now sell them. I think subscribers can get them earlier.
But pretty books? I mean, pretty covers?
Yeah, yeah.
So all of the other books have pretty covers?
I'm not sure that every volume that they have published is available in a box set. Like Henry James, I'm not sure if that is in a box set, but many of them now come out in both formats.
So did you have anything to do with the selection of the box set photographs or illustrations?
There was some debate about that, because I didn't have like the final say on the photographs. We talked about, you know, these photographs, which are sort of standard, you know, black and white photos, and there was actually a photo that they wanted to use on volume 2, which volume 1 has the buffalo, and then volume 2 is that
The tree?
tree. And I argued heavily in favor of the tree because the other option was actually a photograph from Yellowstone, which I thought was inappropriate because it was Yellowstone.
Yeah.
And Yellowstone's not the Great Plains.
Maybe
So,
a comment about what Library of America really is, and because maybe not everybody knows.
yeah. It's a nonprofit foundation that's been around since I think it was founded in the late 80s. And they started with Lincoln, but the idea is to have all of American literature available in authoritative texts, which is a big issue with some books like Moby Dick. You know, there's been a lot of problems with the publication of that, and so to create an authoritative text sometimes takes a lot of research and work. And to have them available in a format that's inexpensive. You know, these are really nicely produced books on good paper that are relatively inexpensive for the quality.
Okay, how about you?
Well, this may not be within your realm, but I'm going to try you because I'm trying to find an authority for the story that I have about Laura's family. When I was in Keystone visiting, I went through the DeSmith, so on, the whole business, and ended up in Keystone where Carrie built a pretty good reputation as a businesswoman and so on. And as you probably know, as everybody knows, that she married an older gentleman named David Swansea. And the story the people in Keystone tell is that David Swansea was responsible for naming Mount Rushmore. And I have not been able to find verification of that in any credible resource. And the story itself is fascinating that as a young man, he was a surveyor that accompanied the government surveyors. And you know this story.
I
probably,
have
no?
heard it, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think I fudged that slightly in my note about that and said that he is said to have been one of the men who may have named Mount Rushmore, because I think it is that was hard to verify.
All the people in Keystone seem to think it's
Yeah.
true. But that
It
was always
does have the
fascinating.
sound of a possible tall tale.
Well, I want a Snoop's version of the story, so I thought you
Yeah.
might have that. But you've heard it, but not verified it independently either.
It occurs in a couple of different places. I think that William Anderson, who is a guy who's written a lot about Wilder and her work, includes it in one of his, I think it's in one of the booklets that he wrote
Well, I
about
often
the
quoted
family.
and have told the story in my seminars and in my writing as well, and I'm just waiting for somebody to say, how in the
Yeah.
do you know that? And I don't, so
Yeah, I
thank you.
think when you look up, the other people who were involved, you do find some other references to it.
Thank you very much.
Well, my friend Nancy made me promise to ask a question.
Okay.
She wanted me to ask you if you could talk about some of your primary resources that you looked at for the research and kind of the extent and scope of it.
For the chronology, the standard way that people go about writing the chronologies for these volumes is to look at all the authoritative biographies that have been published. So it's not necessarily based on primary research, but really on whatever exists. It can include primary research on documents. And indeed, whenever I've quoted from letters that Laura or Rose wrote, and from Laura's diary of her trip from DeSmet to Mansfield, I chose to quote from the originals and not from the version of her diary that was published was edited by Rose, and I chose not to use that, but to use the primary source instead. So that's, I'm not sure if there's a specific question that you had about the notes, but that was, the notes were based on research, looking at various reliable reference works. We don't write notes in the Library of America for anything that's covered in standard reference works. We don't write notes for like the Mississippi River, or, if somebody mentions Lincoln, you don't write a note for that because that's available widely. But any place names, any people who are not public figures, you would write a note for that. So we relied, on standard reference works about the West, about the Homestead Act, about the Indian history. Almost all of the books that were relied on or quoted from are listed at the beginning of the notes section. So that would tell you what the major references were.
So what do you hear from people in audiences about what first got them to Laura Ingalls Wilder? What fond memories they have, or how old they were when they discovered her, or what do you hear from people?
Oh, well, so many people, discover them as kids, read them for the first time. A lot of people have some kind of family connection to the region. They may have had family members who farmed, or were immigrants, to Minnesota, or things like that. So,
Lots of connections.
yeah,
Lots
there's
of connections. How about here? How do people? We have another question, Maeve.
So what do you think, did you also watch the Little House on the Prairie television show at all for this?
I did not.
Have you ever seen it?
I have. I didn't watch it as a kid. And I know a lot of people discovered, Wilder's books from the TV show, which is a good thing, I guess.
My
I'm not a
question is-
huge fan of the show personally, but
And you're not a huge fan because it's not accurate, or?
I think it's just bad.
We'll just leave it at that then.
I think, yeah, I mean, Michael Landon is, and I actually think that he should be criticized a little bit for this, because he was, a very conservative guy who contributed to, Republican campaigns, and he clearly had a kind of personal agenda on the one hand to, make his own career, to sort of revive his career as a Western TV star, which of course came from Bonanza. But he also had a political agenda, which he has, sort of grafted onto the books, which I do find kind of objectionable, not because there are not elements of that. I mean, there's certainly the self-reliance aspect of the books makes them very popular with homeschoolers, and that's fine. I don't, that is not an issue to me. But I felt that he really falsified the books through his show in a way that was not very honest.
I think we have time for another question.
Okay, it's really sort of a comment about both of those. One about the show. My older son read Laura Ingalls Wilder 9, 10 times as a child. He knew them in and out. So when the TV show came on, there was not one episode that he did not sit down, and he loved watching them, but he critiqued them for all their inaccuracy, and he was like maybe 9 or 10 or whatever age he was then. But he still loved the books so much that when he grew up and became a Green Beret and came home on leave, and his younger sister, who's like 13 years younger, the thing he could pacify her with that her big brother had gone away, he signed over his copies of all the Laura Ingalls Wilder books to Suzanne so she could have them. And then 13 years after that, he called me up and he said, "Hey, Mom, you know, Jade would really like to read those books." And I said, "Honey, you seem to have forgotten. You gave those to your sister." "Oh," he said, "I always wondered why I didn't have them to read again." But anyway, so they do
Yeah.
transcend, and he was a very, now I think a lot of, quote, girls read them. I don't see them as popular with boys anymore, and that's almost a shame because there's a
There's
lot in
plenty
there.
yeah.
But anyway, the shows were totally skewered for whatever reason.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think people should feel bad for liking the show. I mean, a lot of people watched it when they were kids and enjoyed it, and that's fine. I just don't think it has very much to do with the books, ultimately.
Okay, do we have any more questions or comments? Anyone wanting to share how they came to the books or to tell Caroline about their experience?
As an author, I'm wondering what brought you to specifically research Laura Ingalls Wilder over any other author out there?
Well, I think probably because I had a personal relationship to the books. Like a lot of people, I read them when I was a kid, and my own grandmother was Swedish, from a family of Swedish immigrant farmers who farmed up in Minnesota. And so that's always been really interesting to me, that that the books really kind of open up that experience. She was always telling me stories about kind of how horrible it was to work on the farm and how much work it was and how she had to take care of all her brothers and sisters. And so it was really interesting to read a kind of fictional account of what were some of the good aspects of that, as well as the stuff I was hearing, and it really made it clear to me how tough that life really was.
Oh my gosh, and
Yeah.
I think somebody said that the kids didn't think the life was tough as an adult reader. Maybe, did you say that you went back and said, oh my gosh, all the
Yeah.
loss and the hardship and poverty and
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
hunger is really evident as an adult reader, but maybe not
Yeah.
to kids, because they're
They are darker,
absorbed
I
in the
think.
adventure
Yeah.
and the nature and having the wolves sing around your house and
Yeah.
the bears coming in and
Yeah.
lots of very exciting things. So
Yeah, I've also written a lot of stuff about ecology and conservation, and the books are really interesting as a history and one version of one person's description of a place that has been kind of altered by people because the buffalo were almost gone, and so that I think is one really powerful aspect of them to a modern reader, is that they both convey how beautiful the Great Plains were to somebody who really appreciated them and really loved them, but also how changed they were even then. Even in the 1870s, they had been altered almost irrevocably, and that's what's so interesting, I think, about the grasshopper story.
Well, Caroline, thank you so much for coming to
Oh,
Iowa
well-
City. We've appreciated it very much. And there are books for sale out in the lobby with Suzanne if you care to stop by, and Caroline's willing to sign them if you'd like to get those and visit for a few minutes after we finish up here. So thank you very much for coming tonight and for your thoughtful questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.